Welcome to Spiritual as Fuck,
Spiritual as fuck.
where spirituality meets the real world. I'm Liz Volpe, serial entrepreneur, passionate changemaker, and intuitive. I love inspiring people to dream big and create positive change in the world.
I'm Diane Driscoll, a coach, facilitator, and speaker who uses channeled insights to activate transformation in leaders, entrepreneurs, and change makers.
We share real and raw spiritual stories, give you a safe space to challenge what's normal, and have some serious fun along the way.
Come join us as we get spiritual as fuck. In today's mind-blowing episode, we are joined by neurosurgeon and best-selling author Dr. Eben Alexander. In 2008, Dr. Alexander went into a week-long medically induced coma due to an inexplicable brain infection. During this time, he experienced a transcendental near-death experience that completely transformed his worldview. He joins us today to share his near-death experience, his insights from his research, and his important work transforming the medical and healthcare systems.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Now, for many of you, you've tuned in every couple of weeks for the last few years, and you will know that Diane and I have this wish list that we've built up over time of people that have had a significant impact on our own spiritual journeys. And today we have such a special guest. Dr. Eben, welcome firstly.
Well, Liz and Diane, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you both today.
Oh, thank you. And I have to say, just starting off with my experience first being introduced to you, I read your book many years ago, your first book, Proof of Heaven. And it was, yes, the first time I had ever read a real experience from someone, firstly with a science background, but actually someone that had a death experience. And my God, it had such an impact on me. I remember firstly not being able to put it down. You know, I was like dying for it to be the end of the day so I could quickly pick up the book and keep reading it. But I remember being left with such a sense of peace and relief, you know, that there was more when we left this world. And I don't know, just a really amazing inner knowing that the words that you put down in that book were absolutely true, and it completely resonated with me. So firstly, thank you for being brave enough to actually share your story.
Beautiful to hear that. I'm so glad it helped you. I know once I figured out what had happened to me, it had so much, these huge implications about the nature of reality. There was no way to kind of hide it and go back into my life as a neurosurgeon, hiding out in the operating room. Really had to share my story. So this is, it's been a tremendous gift because people then share their stories back with me. And that's the gold of this, is thousands and thousands of people sharing their own stories.
Oh, I can't even imagine the stories that you've heard, to be honest. But I'd love to go back, because you were in your normal life, we'll call it, and you woke up in a considerable amount of pain. Can we start there? And you can share in your own words.
Certainly. I think it's important to point out that at that point in my life, I was 54 years old. This is back in November 2008. And I'd spent more than 15 years of my life teaching at Harvard Medical School, teaching neurosurgery, thought I understood something about brain, mind, and consciousness. But I also subscribed to the conventional scientific teachings of materialism or physicalism. That's what many of us were trained in the 20th and early 21st century. It's the idea that only the physical world exists. So if you understand all the linkages of the elements of the physical world, then you can understand how everything works. Well, it turns out that is woefully inadequate because a lot more to this universe than I would have thought before. And it has a lot to do with the mystery of consciousness. Now, don't believe that neuroscience had ever come remotely in the ballpark of being able to explain phenomenal consciousness. We haven't been. It's probably one of the biggest scientific mysteries there is. But that's kind of where I was. I woke up that morning, as this neurosurgeon who thought he understood brain, mind, and consciousness. I didn't know it, but my own brain was being overrun with an extremely severe case of bacterial meningitis. It was E. coli. one of the most deadly forms of meningitis you can have. In fact, almost all cases of E. coli meningitis happen in newborns. It's very rare beyond the age of 3 months. So my doctors had that little mystery, and of course, I have to defend my
Wow.
level of maturity. No, I'm not an infant, but I certainly behaved like that medically by acquiring this incredibly devastating illness, which drove me into coma within 3 hours. From 29 early in the
Mhm.
morning, severe back pain. Thought if I made it down the hallway into a hot bathtub, maybe that would help. Well, I almost couldn't even get out of the bathtub, and then struggled back to my bed, writhing in agony. Soon thereafter, my youngest son, Bond, came in the room and realized, my gosh, Dad's not up at work, and boy, he looks horrible. He came up and started rubbing my temples, and as soon as he touched my head, I felt like he'd driven a white hot railroad spike.
Oh gosh.
Horrible pain. I cannot describe it. But the good news is I was just about gone from this world and to a point of no longer suffering. Uh, I my family thought I was very ill, but they thought if they let me rest, maybe I'd get better. Well, they checked on me a few hours later. I was having grand mal epileptic seizures on the
Oh
bed.
my
I was
gosh.
already in coma. There's a myth out there in the kind of lay press from a very kind of malign author who was trying to discredit me. And he said I was in a medically induced coma. That is not the case at all. Um, in fact, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's one of the foremost authorities on NDEs as an MD, studied them as a skeptical psychiatrist for more than 25 years. But in his chapter 10 of his book After, he devotes it entirely to my case, and he makes it clear that I went into coma without any sedation. In fact, when I came out of coma, I was still on very strong sedation. So it's very important from a scientific viewpoint to recognize that this coma was caused by the severe case of meningitis. And there's a medical case report on my medical records written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. And that medical
Mhm.
report is in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018. We make it very clear that brain was in no shape to have any kind of dream or hallucination.
Yes.
That haunted me when I read my medical records in the weeks and months after my coma. I said, wait a minute. I had this incredible experience. I was not expecting to find such definitive evidence of a destroyed brain, which is what those medical records reveal. And I spent that 7 days in coma. Of course, my family just saw me lying there in coma, unresponsive on a ventilator on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics. By the end of that week, the doctors estimated I'd gone from 10% chance of survival down to 2%, and with no real chance of recovery. And that's why they recommended stopping the antibiotics, letting nature take its course. Well, a few hours later is when I started coming back to this world, but they were right. When I started waking up, my brain was horribly savaged by this. I didn't even
Yeah.
recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside, had no idea who these beings were. All I knew was this incredibly rich, ultra real spiritual journey I had been on deep in coma. And
Mhm.
it's the memories of that are as sharp today as if the whole thing happened yesterday.
Oh my
Oh,
God.
to still have that. Yes.
That extraordinary and beautiful journey of connection with the universe when my brain was offline. And it was, by medical standards, it was terribly damaged and certainly in no shape for dream or
Oh,
hallucination.
Dr. Eben, please take us there. It's like I want to feel it in your own words. Like as Liz read it, sometimes it's different when you're reading a book compared to hearing someone firsthand
Well,
sharing,
listen,
paint the
one of
picture
those things
for
I'll tell
us.
you that many people have both read the book Proof of Heaven and listened to the audiobook. And they tell me, even though the words are identical in the two sources, they tell me by listening to my voice, this story has
Yes.
so much more power.
Well,
I read the audiobook. I couldn't imagine asking anyone else to read that story.
Of course, it's yours.
Because a lot of the power of the truth and the reality of it
Mm.
comes through in my voice. But anyway, so now let's take you back. Important to point out, there's one very atypical feature of my near-death experience that I think was also part of this horrific meningitis, or at least it was meant to be early on, and that is amnesia. I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life. When I went into this coma, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive force, kind of subterranean place. But at that point, I had no memory of Earth, humans, this universe.
Ah,
It was totally an empty slate. There was
yeah.
no memory of Eben Alexander's life. And I figured out in the months and years after my coma why that had to be. It really had to do with my accepting this as reality, as opposed to rejecting it. And
Mm.
that's why that amnesia was so critical, because I had to take an especially deep dive to kind of see things about memory and conscious experience that I wouldn't have been able to appreciate as much if I'd had full memories of my life and gone into a more kind of standard life review. I would have rejected it. But this deep dive, especially the identity of a spiritual guide that I encounter as the story unfolds, were absolutely essential elements. So, beginning in this earthworm eye view, very primitive, coarse, unresponsive, I had no body awareness during any part of this journey, but I was
Gosh.
spectacle, so I could kind of witness what was going on around me. And in this gateway, I mean, in this earthworm eye view, it was primitive and coarse and kind of underground and foreboding, when I use these words to describe it. But given my amnesia, I just accepted this is the way things are. So it was not as disturbing as it might sound by my description. The good news is it didn't last forever. There came a slowly spinning white light. And that light was very pure in many ways, but it also had an appearance like ground glass. And it had fine silvery and golden tendrils around it. And as it came towards me, very slowly spinning and enlarging, I realized that it also came with a perfect musical melody. And that was important because so far in this earthworm eye view, the only sound I'd heard was something like a smashing, a
Okay.
slamming on an anvil. That's kind of the way I described it. And now, all of a sudden, with this approaching light, there was a beautiful, perfect musical melody. And the reason that's important is because I was able to use my memory of those musical notes much later on in the journey when I would ascend through all these spiritual levels, but then spontaneously tumble back down to that earthworm eye view by remembering those musical notes in my mind. That could
Ah,
conjure up that light portal again. So music, vibration, frequency are things
yes.
that we can often use as information to help guide our spiritual journey. And that's what I was discovering in that first phase. So this beautiful light, it opened like a portal, like a wormhole up into this brilliant, ultra real Gateway Valley. It was much more real than this world. That's something that's very hard to describe to
Ah,
people. And it's
yes.
very commonly part of a description of NDEs. And part of the reason is that that realm is absolutely timeless. For example, that's where people would have their life flash before your eyes. You've heard of the life review, maybe. The
Yes.
life review happens in anywhere from 25 to 50% of near death experiences. It's a very astonishing thing to study. Now, I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review because of my amnesia, but I witnessed life reviews. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes in a much stronger kind of generic fashion, but without having a personal Eben Alexander life review. So anyway, in this beautiful Gateway Valley, um, I remember I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations. And below us was this meadow. It was this perfect meadow surrounded by a forest. There were sparkling waterfalls and crystal blue pools. And there were thousands of people dancing, lots of joy and merriment going on. I remember incredible scenes of dogs jumping and
Oh,
children playing incredible festivities, and it was all being fueled up above by these swooping orbs of angelic choirs, these pure kind of spiritual orbs that seemed to be individual sentient angelic beings that were emanating these chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And I remember early on in this part of the journey, I had what I call the soft summer breeze of the divine wind, this
oh,
breath of God blow through the scene. And even though the elements that I would describe of that scene would not have changed with that summer breeze, the thing that did change was my emotional awareness of that God force, of that pure, infinitely loving God force at the core of all reality. And that's what I was feeling like so many other near death experiencers. I mean, it's such a common part of NDEs that more than 90% of near death experiencers going back across all history, thousands of years, all continents, all belief systems, but more than 90% of them come back not just believing, but knowing in the reality
yes.
of this
Mm,
loving force at the core of the universe. And it doesn't matter if you want to try and label that, God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, because essentially we're all trying to describe the same powerful force of connection and love that has kind of, our highest and best interest is part of that intelligence, that God force. And it is such a gift to have experienced that. And I'll tell you right now that any human being does not need an NDE to get this. If you just spend some time in prayer and meditation, going within, exploring consciousness, you start to discover everything you need to know about the reality of that God force. It's just important for us to take time out from our busy little kind of material bodies in these material
Yes.
do that. And we can talk a little later about sacred acoustics and how I use that for meditation, et cetera, because I've used meditation on a daily basis for the last 12 or 13 years to return to my NDE and not only, retrieve additional memories from it all, but to further develop my relationship with everything that I encounter there. So I'm back in my NDE in this beautiful Gateway Valley, that soft summer breeze blowing through, and that was my awareness of the divine and the kind of power of these chants and anthems and hymns started to really sink in because it was part of my experience of existing as a sentient being in a spiritual being in a spiritual universe, and that's what I was witnessing full bore at that point. Now, the best part about this, in witnessing all this incredible festivities going on below, these angelic choirs and all of that, was that I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing, sparkling blue eyes, forehead, high cheekbone, broad smile. She never said a word. She never had to. But her message, delivered to me kind of telepathically, was very powerful. And although it came in pure conceptual and emotional flow, uh, what I wrote down weeks later in trying to report that message from her to me, it was, "You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear."
Oh, beautiful.
And you
Oh my goodness.
wrong. I wish I'd explained that piece a little better in the book Proof of Heaven, because for me, so deeply into this journey, I recognized in that ambience of infinitely loving God force that where we have life reviews, anything we've done that was selfish or greedy looks especially bad in that setting.
Mm.
And so do no wrong means that I was aligned with knowing the power and the beauty and the kind of purpose of the universe in sharing love, kindness, compassion, and mercy with our fellow beings. That is the most straightforward pathway as an evolving soul. And yet we have the free will to do otherwise. But that otherwise, if we mistreat others and hand out a lot of pain and suffering, that means our life review is not going to be very pleasant. Because in
Yeah.
general, more than three-quarters of people who have life reviews and large scientific series will tell you is it's a reliving of the events of your life from everybody's perspective. So if you've been
Wow.
generous and
Yeah.
handing out love and wonderful benevolence to everybody, all that reflects back to you in the life review. It's a very good experience. But if you've been handing out a lot of pain and suffering, when all that is reflected back on you, and you have to feel what those around you felt when that occurred, I think that's where our notions of hell come from, actually.
Wow.
There's any room in any of the system for an eternal hell of damnation and that kind of thing. But anyway, so I had this lovely, incredible message from this guardian angel who was with me on the butterfly wing. Now, another important part to share about the story is that I was adopted. My birth mother was 16 years old, unwed, and back in 1953, what that meant was I ended up being taken over by social services at age 11 days. But then my birth mother
Oh
was
gosh.
signed the release papers. So I got stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months without
Oh
anybody.
wow.
And, I'm not asking for any sympathy because I was adopted into a wonderful, loving
Mm.
family. My adoptive father was a neurosurgeon, globally renowned, and
Wow.
he
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
led me into neurosurgery. But I remember he used to tell me when I was younger, you can't possibly remember anything that happened to you when you were only days and weeks old. So he was trying to convince me I couldn't remember being put up for adoption. And I can tell you now he was wrong.
Oh wow.
Powerful kind of smoking crater memory of being abandoned by my mother. I mean, a lot of adopted children have that. In fact, a lot of children have that if they don't feel like they really belong in their family. This kind of separation from the spiritual is is a universal phenomenon, but the way
Mm.
I experienced it was this adoption abandonment wound. And of course, all of that story comes together much later when we uh, get into the period post coma and kind of investigation into that beautiful angel on the butterfly wing. But back to
Yeah.
my story. Um, so what happened was I remember in that beautiful setting with her very reassuring and affirming message to me that in fact those angelic choirs became yet another sound portal. And I remember seeing all of, I could kind of sense the four-dimensional world uh, down below our spiritual realms. And I sensed all of that four-dimensional world collapsing down. And then all of this rich spiritual realm, what I call the Gateway Valley, um, with all these kind of brilliant ultra real scenes, all of that collapsed down. And remember that that also is completely timeless realm. That's where you would have your life reviews, birth, death, everything in between simultaneously presented to you. That is one of the reasons why these journeys are so ineffable. We see so much in the way of connection there that's just not apparent to us when we're living our lives forward in Earth time. And yet, in the life reviews, when you review large scientific series like Bruce Grayson's series of almost 700 life reviews and thousands of NDEs, he found that about a third of people said that their entire life is involved in a life review. And you wonder, how can you have your whole life if
Yes.
it's like a 10-minute cardiac arrest? It's because in that realm, our perceptions are completely outside of Earth time. So
Yeah, time has no
our
meaning.
life is a possibility. It's not stressing the system at all because that system has far more power to kind of investigate our lives and our reasons for being than we might imagine. And yet, that's exactly what comes out of descriptions of large scientific series of NDEs and life reviews. So anyway, but for me, all of that collapsed down into this complex, what I called an oversphere, and I felt myself ascending through yet another light portal. But this was kind of beyond a boundary, a perceived boundary, getting into that sanctum sanctorum of the divine itself, which I call the core realm. And the core realm is one where everything comes down into oneness. We live in a world of duality where we have
Mhm.
light and dark, we have good and evil, we have masculine, feminine, all kinds of different spectra of possibilities. And yet, the closer we get to that spiritual source, all of that collapses down into one. So, what I was witnessing when I entered this core realm was this complex oversphere, which was the entire universe throughout all of eternity, as a teaching tool, but then also this sense of that divine, infinitely loving and creative source, that God force, as being the very source of my conscious awareness. There was no way to be separate from it. Now, this is not some little ego Eben Alexander saying I became God, but it's
Yes.
one of any of us who is a spiritual being in a spiritual universe where spirituality, to me, it doesn't require any kind of religious ideology at all, even though religions can be
Mm.
used to support spirituality. Sometimes, unfortunately, religious ideologies actually go against love, compassion, kindness, and
Yes.
of each other, the deepest lessons of these journeys. And so for me, that witnessing of that oneness with the divine was a very powerful spiritual experience that kind of clued me into the bigger nature of who we are and how we're interconnected through that mind. And so these days, when I use the word spirituality, I'm only implying three things that are involved. One is the connection through the mental layer. That's why things like telepathy work. That's why, and I'll point out for anybody who doesn't know, roughly 35% of identical twins have very powerful telepathic experiences. So it's something you can demonstrate. There's a great book
Mm.
Guillaume Playfair wrote called Twin Telepathy that goes into all that. But telepathy is very real phenomenon of the kind of continuity of our minds and the connection of our minds. The other two ingredients for spirituality are a shared sense of meaning to
Mhm.
how we live our lives, what we experience, what we consider valuable, and also purpose, the very reasons we're here and our purpose for existence. And it turns out there's a lot of sharing of purpose, meaning, and that identity through the layer of mind that starts to become apparent the more you get into this. And this is where meditation and centering prayer can be so important. And for anyone out there who doesn't have a powerful meditative technique, I would recommend Sacred Acoustics at sacredacoustics.com, which is the brainchild of my partner, my wife, Karen Newell.
Ooh, I can't wait to check that out.
Definitely.
An hour or two every day for the last 11 or 12 years. A lot of it brings me much closer to my near-death experience and to the various entities there. And in fact, in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that was co-written with Karen, um, that book describes an extraordinary meditative experience I had 2.5 years after coma, where I first encountered the soul of my adoptive father, that neurosurgeon. He had passed over 4 years before my coma, but he was nowhere to be found in my NDE, shockingly enough to me. And yet, 2.5 years later in meditation, I had a very profound connection with him that explained everything. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to the journey
So
here.
much, there's so much.
In this core realm, I often describe it as a dazzling darkness. As I said, it's a resolution of all dualities where we realize the kind of oneness of existence and a oneness of our mind and our ability to connect with others and connect with so many kind of possible influences in this world we live in. And in that core realm, every time I entered it, I was told, we'll teach you many things, but you're not here to stay. You'll be going back. And there were many lessons that occurred in that core. Two of the most powerful, one I call the flying fish vision. And this was a very extraordinary vision early on, one of the early passages through the core. And in the flying fish vision, I could easily see reincarnation and life reviews for all humans. And the way I saw that was this vision of these fish down in the water, but when they left the physical body at the time of bodily death, they'd come up into the beautiful air and they'd be flying along. And then they'd reunite with their fellow beings in soul form up in the air, go through life reviews, plan next incarnations, and then dive back in. And that was an early version. And then I had a much more refined version because I would cycle through all these levels, as I've said multiple times. And there came a later vision that I call the Indra's Net vision, and that was a very powerful. It took me years, probably 2 or 3 years, to figure out what these visions really meant and to put any kind of meaning to them. But the Indra's Net vision was this incredibly rich vision of interwoven threads of this higher dimensional tapestry that had this beautiful golden center, and the golden center, in many ways. Uh, had also been represented by this orb of light that I saw in the core that I saw as either a translator or interpreter, and, uh, like a Christ consciousness or something that enabled me to connect so directly with that oneness of that divine God force. Um, and in this interwoven tapestry, I could easily see all these threads, which basically showed our lives as souls, as eternal souls going through multiple incarnations, all woven together, but leading towards a purpose. So this is not a version of reincarnation where it's like in Buddhism, you're trying to get off the wheel of suffering. And that's how they can often interpret stories of reincarnation. But this is much more one of grace, of fulfillment, of actual progress, of evolution of
Yes.
self that we're all contributing to. And so it's a much richer form of a very positive and optimistic view of our souls coming back again and again towards getting this right. Now, very important to point out here, some people are very worried when they hear all this. They go, wait a minute, what if my loved one reincarnates before I get there? But I remind you of the timelessness of that realm. And that when you're in that realm, birth, death, everything in between, past lives, potentials for future lives, you witness it all as if it's now. And that is the power of that realm. And there's so much dependence on love and connection and shared mission that there's no way I could ever interpret any of this to imply that a soul would not be there when they're needed at the time of crossing over of another soul. So don't worry about that. It's something the universe takes care of very beautifully by having this extraordinary kind of connection across what we see as Earth time to bring things together.
Oh,
Anyway, So, back in my journey in this beautiful core realm, multiple visions. I don't have time to go into a lot more. I've discussed them in hundreds of talks and
Yeah.
etc. But anyway, what would happen is I'd tumble back down to that earthworm eye view. And as I said before, by remembering the musical notes of the melody, I was able to conjure up this beautiful light portal that let me up into the Gateway Valley. And always welcomed there by that beautiful blue-eyed woman on the butterfly wing, and reassured and shown this incredible festivity and just this recharge of kind of my emotional power through those anthems and chants and hymns and this incredible sense of kind of rich purpose and meaning and joy and bliss to see. I mean, it was really uh, indescribable. You cannot put
Yes.
words to this kind of thing. They're so hard to describe. But I would go through these multiple levels, and then finally there came a point when I could no longer conjure up using the musical notes and the memory of the notes. I could no longer conjure up the light portal that took me from the earth from my view up into the Gateway Valley. To say I was sad at that point would be something of an understatement, but I also knew I could trust. I'd been told so many times every time I passed through there by that beautiful angel and then reassured in the core will teach you many things. You are richly loved and cared for. I mean,
Mm.
it was an incredible journey in that sense. Um, but now there was a time when could no longer get up out of this kind of ugly starting point. And luckily I could trust. And what I then witnessed, thousands of beings going off around me into the distance, heads bowed like that, some holding candles. And there was this murmuring energy coming from them. But the surprise to me was that murmuring energy to me felt very reassuring, like I was back in my spiritual home, just as I had felt on first entering the Gateway Valley and the core. This incredible sense of belonging and of comfort and a memory that it had happened before and all was well, that I would be
Mm.
taken care of. And I remember the way I wrote all that up in the weeks after my coma, I said that all that sense of those beings around me and their murmuring energy was the power of prayer. It was drawing me
Yes.
to this
Oh,
world. I didn't
wow.
know yet this was
Yeah.
my destiny, coming back to the earthly realm. And then the last thing I saw in my NDE in the spiritual realm, six faces that would kind of bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words. I couldn't understand the words because my amnesia was still very much in effect. But then they disappear. I remember those six faces right now as sharply as if this had all happened yesterday. And the interesting thing is that five of those faces were people who were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. And notably,
Oh, wow.
friends who had been there earlier in the week were not in my memories at all. And what that helped to show to me was that the vast majority of the spiritual journey that seemed to last for months or years, the vast majority of that had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5
Mm.
of a 7-day coma. And we talk about all that in the books and both
Yeah.
Proof of and Living in a Mindful Universe. Um, but it was really the sixth face, the last face I saw that got my attention. And that was, I didn't recognize him at the time, but it was a 10-year-old boy. It was my son, Bond. That was Sunday morning,
Oh.
day 7.
Oh.
They had protected Bond from the worst news during this week.
Yeah.
Said, "Oh, Dad's sick, but we think he's gonna be okay." Well, and he saw me on a ventilator, not unresponsive. That was very disturbing to him. But on day 7, the doctors held a family conference. They said I'd gone from 10% chance of survival down to 2%, no chance of recovery, and therefore, it was time to let me go.
Oh
And I
gosh.
didn't like that one bit. Came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids that had been taped shut. I'm on my ventilator. One eye looking over there, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. And he was pleading with me, "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy,
Oh,
Oh, bless him.
I don't know how that would make it so." Now, I didn't understand those words, and I didn't know who he was. And I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears. I was far too gone from this world, and the evidence in my nervous system was shut down, was too complete. And yet the message got through deep
Oh
in that
wow.
spiritual realm, this pleading of another soul. And during this entire journey, because of my amnesia, I thought, well, this can all continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. Well, now all of a sudden, everything mattered because I recognized there was another soul out there that needed me deeply, and I had to do something. And yet I didn't understand the workings of this world at all. And so what then ends up happening is end up getting ushered back to this world, as so many NDEers come back to this world because they have a responsibility to be back for someone else, for a loved one.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what was going on in my case. It wasn't a choice, one that I remember as a willful choice on my part, but I knew I had to be with him. I had to do
Mm.
something to help him, to be there for him. And so it wasn't long thereafter that I found myself waking up in this ICU bed. But as I said earlier, my brain was still so savaged by the meningitis. My mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside, I had no idea who these beings were. All I knew was where I'd just been. In fact, my youngest sister, Phyllis, tells kind of a funny story because she got there about 20 or 30 minutes after they extubated me, um, something like that. And she said she came in the room and I was sitting there like this little Buddha on the bed, and I would look at each person, the doctor, nurse, family, friend. I'd look at each person, and I'd say, "Don't worry, all is well.
Wow. Oh my
Don't
gosh.
worry, all is well." It's
Oh,
an amazing thing because they spent the whole week, the doctors assuring them that I was in deep trouble and probably going to die from this thing. And now I was sitting there, within an hour or two of waking up from coma, and I'm just trying to reassure everybody that everything is fine. There's nothing to worry about.
What a
gosh.
miracle. Oh, you can't even
And,
imagine.
and
Oh,
even the fact that you think that in that point in time, your family are grappling with the fact that you have miraculously come back to life, but also you don't remember them. So you're telling them all is fine, even though I don't know who you are. The contrast of that is huge.
It was very frightening for them.
Yeah.
I know, for example, my older son, Eben the fourth, who's a doctor now, who's gone into training as a physician. But he had been with me during the worst of that time, worst of that week, holding my hand 24/7 with the rest of the family.
Yeah.
But when I was starting to kind of come around, he'd gone back to school to finish off some exams. Um, but I remember he told me when he then came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital, and he gave me a big hug. He said it was like there was a light shining within me, like I was far more present than I'd ever been before. And I remember telling him it was way too real to be real. Because to me, that was the best explanation was that was an extraordinary experience. And my doctors had already told me, "Oh, the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks." And I didn't know yet all the data in my medical records of how bad my
Yes.
by the
Mm.
meningitis. And so I told him it was way too real to be real. My doctors told me, "Forget about it." They said, "Your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us." But that was as I went on and on, more and more studying my medical records, that's when I started realizing there's something very wrong with this picture. There's no way that brain of mine in that deep coma from meningitis could have had any dream or hallucination,
Mm.
much less the most profound experience I've ever had. So Evan was the one who told me because he was studying neuroscience in college at the time. He said, "Well, make sure you write down everything you remember about your NDE before you read anyone else's NDE."
Yes. Fantastic
good
advice.
advice.
I wanted to read every NDE I could get my hands on, but he was right. And
Yes.
I wrote about 20,000 words, and that was my base document that was untainted because I'd never paid attention to that literature before. I always thought NDEs were the trick of the dying brain,
Yes. Yes.
yeah, you see what you want to see. But that's why I had to have such a deep dive. And of course, the identity of that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing, for those who've read the book Proof of Heaven, is incredibly important for
Mhm.
understanding my journey. And all that's made clear at the end of Proof of Heaven. I won't go into too much detail now, but I will confess, yes, it does have to do with my adoption story and an incredibly unbelievable connection
Yes.
with that birth family. And that's what got my attention 4 months after my coma when I went, well, it all seemed way too real to be real because it really happened. And I finally had to
Absolutely.
accept that and everything pointed in that direction, but I had struggled with it, especially because my adoptive father was not there, and he should have been there as a spiritual guide. And yet, if he had been, I came to realize, as he told me himself 2.5 years later in a deep meditative experience, if he had been there, I would have been more tempted to dismiss it as who I wanted to
Yeah.
be on the way out. And that's why
Yes.
this kind of mystery guardian angel who was someone I'd never met in my life, and yet she was extremely important to me in my life.
I think it's so important just for our listeners now that for me, I know that part of your story is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. So encouraging people to read your books to learn that part of the story as well, because yeah, it's especially if you're someone who's fascinated by NDEs and you've listened to lots of stories or read lots of books on the topic. This for me was a whole, I'm even getting goosebumps now as I'm saying this, because it is such a powerful story. And I know for us there's so many facets of your story that we want to go into, and it's really important too to look at the fact of this incredible experience has happened to you, and then where does one go from there? What do you do with your life? How does this transform your life? How does this inform? You go from being a neurosurgeon to having this profound experience to then not even knowing who your family is. Where to next?
Well, that's where the whole thing kind of opened up for me, was
Yeah.
examining every bit of that. And, it turns out, I'll tell a little bit more of that story, but I finally ended up meeting my birth family a year before my coma. And that was a very, very important step in kind of putting this all together. And then that whole set of relationships has really expanded and grown tremendously since then, getting to know people in my birth family, including extended family. I mean, just all the connections of that. I mean, there's some strange synchronicities in there. Just in fact, my career choice of going into vascular neurosurgery. That was a decision I made. I was finished medical school in 1980 at Duke, and then I did my neurosurgery residency at Duke. And in the mid 80s, I was deciding what subfield of neurosurgery I wanted to go into. You can go into brain tumors, you can go
Yeah.
into functional work like Parkinson's and deep brain stimulators, spine, pediatrics. There are all kinds of different subcategories within neurosurgery. I went for vascular. I wanted to clip aneurysms and take out arteriovenous malformations. That was my passion. I did 2 years of lab work in vascular neurosurgery in the mid 80s. Then I did a fellowship in 1987 in England, all about aneurysms and vascular neurosurgery. And then lo and behold, I find out years later in the early 2000s that the only reason I can even connect with my birth family through the children's home in North Carolina is because my family had a predisposition to aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage.
Oh.
My mother's birth mother's father died of a subarachnoid hemorrhage in 1965. In fact, he was probably seen by my father in consultation weeks later when it was too late.
Oh.
My older sister, I mean my mother's youngest sister, uh, she died of a subarachnoid hemorrhage in 1978 in her 30s. And then my other aunt, because I only have two aunts in that family, the other aunt had a hemorrhage in 2004 from an aneurysm. So in
Wow,
the
that's
2000s, I
crazy.
find out that's the reason I actually have information from my birth family to connect with them. And that was all 15 years after I made the decision to go into vascular neurosurgery. That's a huge kind of synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, I love it when you can connect those dots.
Yeah, it's astonishing, but there's been so much more that has to do with reconnecting with the birth family and everything that has really kind of filled out my notion of who I am and
Yeah.
helped come to a deeper understanding of this kind of spiritual relationship with the universe at large and an
Mm.
acknowledgement that our loved ones, when they've left the physical body, that does not mean they're unavailable to us. And that's why in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, Karen Newell and I, my wife, go into great detail about modern neuroscience and philosophy of mind and evidence of non-local consciousness, not just telepathy, but things like remote viewing, uh,
Yes.
life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. I never realized before my coma that there was a huge scientific database supporting reincarnation, but there is.
Yeah.
Multiple investigators have studied it. One of the biggest groups and most prominent groups is the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, where for 65 years they've investigated claims of past lives in children. Of course, a lot of children will claim past lives, and we all think in our culture, oh, what a nice imagination they have.
Yes.
Look into it. Well, it turns out that Ian Stevenson, who was the head of psychiatry at UVA back in the 60s, said, well, let's start looking into some of these. And they did, and they started solving some of them. So to this date, they've investigated more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children over the last 65 years. And of those cases, more than 1,700 are what they call solved. That is, they actually found the person, names, events, dates of injuries,
Wow.
like
Yes.
that. In
Yeah.
fact, one third of his of Stevenson's original series also had birthmarks or birth defects that corresponded to the lethal wound of the prior lifetime. So you can, say, I don't remember a past life. That doesn't mean nobody does. And the other interesting thing is, as these doctors, Ian Stevenson and now Jim Tucker, will tell you, you must harvest these memories before age 6 or 7 because they're natural processes that cover them over in all of us. So,
Mm.
no surprise that as teenagers and adults, we don't remember past lives and between lives. But as
Yeah.
young children, and you start to get a lot of stories. And if you start pursuing those stories to check for names and details, you end up finding that some of them are actual cases of reincarnation.
Mm.
So it's incredible. We live in this era where scientific study of these kind of things really supports that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, that we're really sharing one mind. We're all truly
Mm.
in this together. So this major rule of the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, is in many ways is written into the fabric of the universe.
Yes.
Life review. The fact that
Mm.
1/3, I'm sorry, 3/4 of life reviews see it as from the perspective of everybody involved. That's a lot of life reviews to have that powerful quality of kind of one mind. And in fact, our whole book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is talking about the one mind that we share. There's several other great resources for that one mind hypothesis, but I think it's where a lot of the scientific community is headed on this. But it's important for us to understand as individuals that what that really means is we're here to take care of each other.
Yes. Absolutely.
The last and the lost. And I know
Yeah.
it's become politically unpopular to support refugees, but I can't see any other way from having been through the experience I went through than to conclude we really need to help refugees. We need to help people who have been victimized in their homelands and terrorized by various elements. We need to help people who are in trouble like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think certainly here in the U.S., I'm uh, kind of concerned about the lack of concern we have for people under the current political system. But I firmly believe that as spiritual beings, we ultimately need to show that responsibility and help our fellow beings
Yeah.
when they need our assistance. So there's no better way to kind of facilitate your way forward in this evolution of consciousness itself and profession of the values of NDEs, kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, forgiveness when necessary, um, and never forget gratitude. So,
Yes.
very powerful concepts that sometimes get drilled out of us with the kind of daily hammering of the materialist message in the media, and yet deep down, we're all truly spiritual beings. And the more we get in touch with that, I think the healthier we can become, both as individuals, as social groups, and as humanity and a planet of sentient beings at large.
I love that you have shared that because that was one of the questions that I did want to ask you, like almost like your advice for humanity. And like you've said that so beautifully. And it is that, level of compassion towards each other as well. I would love to know, given your experience, so, having been a vascular neurosurgeon, in the depths of so much science and evidence, and the physicality of it all, then to have gone through this, hugely spiritual experience. What, if anything, would you love for the medical and healthcare community and medical and healthcare professionals to know, based on all of your work, all of your life experience, all of your death experience? What is it
Well,
that you would love everyone to know?
I would say not just the medical community, but a message for all of us
Yeah.
is that we have tremendous power to come into wholeness. I've come to appreciate how placebo effect is just the beginning of our power to willfully bring the world of our dreams into fruition. And that is one of the most important messages. Take some time every day to go within, meditation,
Mhm.
centering prayer, to start exploring consciousness, and investigate the possibilities. And remember that your beliefs are very important. If you believe none of this is possible, you will close the doors to your discovery of it. If you believe all of this is possible, you will find more and more of the kind of spiritual power you have, in the universe to manifest the reality of your dreams. And the more that aligns with kind of the love of the creator for the creation, that is, the more it serves the higher good, and that involves love, kindness, and compassion for our fellow beings. And never forget that animals are also part of this spiritual world. Uh,
Yes.
so it's very important to kind of bring them into the fold and respect animals for the living creatures they are. And I think that this world can become a far better place as we come to acknowledge this power we have. Now, it begins with placebo effect, which of course has taken the medical world by storm. And you can look at placebo effect several different ways, but it's much more than just a sugar pill fixing a headache. And when you
Yes.
start realizing that very major diseases, you know, uh, uh, coronary artery disease in the heart, things like that, can be reversed through kind of the positivity of kind of spiritual balance, prayer, emotional engagement, things like that. It becomes very valuable to do that, to start to see oneness and wholeness for self and others, and find when you find that prayer actually does seem to have a powerful effect. My good friend, Dr. Larry Dossey, has written extensively about that. His book, Healing Words, is one of my favorites, and also Be Careful What You Pray For. But
Mhm.
the reality is, the more any of us can investigate that, well, the more we discover that we do have real power in bringing health, wholeness, and healing to ourselves and to our fellow beings when we engage in doing that kind of thing. And I think that's very helpful when you can move beyond placebo effect and go to spontaneous remission. For example, if you go to noetics.org, the Institute of Noetic Sciences website in California, you'll find, put in the search term spontaneous remission, you'll find a book they wrote in the mid 1990s. I think it was uh, O'Reilly and Hirschberg or something like that. I'm sorry, I'm blocking on the names of the two authors. Anyway, you'll find that book, Noetic Sciences, where they describe more than 3,500 cases of people who have healed themselves from advanced cancer, advanced infections, et cetera, some even healing congenital anomalies they were born with. And I love how they often identify that spiritual factors were involved in that additional healing that goes
Yes.
beyond kind of medical healing. And Kelly Turner wrote a beautiful book based on 1,000 of those cancer cases from the Noetic Sciences database. It's called Radical Remission, and it's a very good book where she identifies 6 of the 9 major features that people had used to get additional healing beyond what wasn't working in the medical world. And it's just a very powerful example of how our connection as spiritual beings and our identification with our spiritual nature can help us come into healing. And then you can move beyond placebo effect and spontaneous remission into the world of near death experiences that involve miraculous healing. Because the
Mm.
full story of the medical report on my medical records is when the 3 doctors who wrote it, again, not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery, put this paper forward to the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. The scientific peer review editors of that journal challenged them, said, "How do you explain this case? It's unprecedented in the medical literature that somebody
Yeah.
with this kind of gram-negative bacterial meningitis involving all lobes of their brain in coma for 7 days with a CSF glucose of 1 and an absent oculocardiac reflex, how could that person come back to have a full recovery?" And the doctors who wrote the case report said it's because he had a near death experience. So the scientific peer review editors say, okay, now we have an explanation. Let's move on. And they published it. So putting near-death experience in the title was very important to the authors to connect more of these cases. They knew more
Yes.
cases of people with profound NDEs, like Anita Morjani, who wrote the book
Mhm.
Dying to Be Me. She had a profound NDE and healed herself from an advanced lymphoma, an advanced cancer that just disappeared after she came back. Likewise, Dr. Mary C. Neal, she wrote a book, To Heaven and Back. She's a colleague of mine, a friend, orthopedic surgeon who had a profound NDE while kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s, where her kayak got jammed under boulders under a waterfall. She was underwater for more than 30 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Ask any doctor, what is that patient going to be like? Well, when they brought her to the surface, she was dead, but they resuscitated her and she ended up making a full recovery. And then me going around, like Anita going around telling this beautiful story. And again, it's not dependent on your religious uh, ideology.
Yeah.
This access to heaven comes from those who emulate the greatest prophets who have shown love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance. It's by doing as those great teachers have done, sharing pure, unconditional love with our fellow beings. That's what opens up our doorway to that access, to that beautiful community. And yet, the reality is, even those who have led very kind of damaging and pain inducing lives to others, they still have that access. They go through the life review. And if there are lessons that they still have to learn, they'll come back and learn those in the next incarnation. But that's why it's best to learn as much as we can, follow the highest path we can. That is the one that's closest towards giving unconditional love, kindness, compassion, mercy,
Yeah.
forgiveness to all of our fellow beings, and forgive yourself for starters. I came back realizing that so much of the travesty of our modern world is we don't even forgive ourselves enough as those divine spiritual beings that we are. But remember that too. And this is not some kind of ego worship situation, but one more of focusing on the higher good for all involved and
Mm.
trying to help our fellow beings. That ultimately is one of the greatest reasons we can exist in these bodies and help our fellow beings as they navigate their way through this beautiful gift of a planet that we live on, and then acknowledge that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. So we live in a much grander realm than just this physical world, but this is where we get the work done. This is
There's so many golden nuggets there.
this is where we grow.
Like I think I need to re-listen to this and write them all down. And
Yes.
I'd love to ask Dr. Eben. I know that you use this incredible story and share it around the world, and you've given so many, I guess, gifts to everyone that hears it. I would love to know, what is the one question that you hear more than any other after you've shared this story? What is that one thing that you hear from people that just stands out to you?
Part of it, I think one of the most kind of probing questions that I seem to encounter over all these 16 or so years since my coma is, how do you know this was real?
Mm.
Mhm.
That is a tough question. And to me, the answer becomes very clear, especially the more you know about medicine. The more anyone knows about medicine who reviews that medical case report in the September 2018 Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, and then reads my story, you realize none of that was possible.
Yes.
Mental materialism. It could not have happened. Just zero chance of possibility. That's why I was so haunted in my
Mm.
own discovery, because I took my doctor's advice early on. Dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. They would pat me on the shoulder like they knew what they were talking about. And of course, that's before all my neurosurgical knowledge had come back. It took about 2 months for most of my semantic knowledge of physics, cosmology,
Of
neuroscience,
course. Yes.
Mm.
come back. It took a long time. And all that, those 2 months, and after that, I was busy going to the hospital, talking to my doctors, going through the medical records, looking at my scans, trying to make sense of this. Now, wait a minute. How did all of that happen when my brain was so demonstrably offline?
Yes.
And as they make clear in the case report, there was no place in my brain to harbor any kind of conscious awareness. The neocortex, the six-layered cortex of the brain, is where all the detailed calculations of our human awareness come from, according to modern neuroscience. And yet my neocortex was turned off. My brainstem was turned off. If you read the case report, you'll see what I mean. I mean, some people look at me today and say, well, you can't have been that sick. Well, that's the
Yes.
question when you do some homework and realize where this all started. And it started in a place of extreme illness that should have killed me. And that's the point that those three doctors who read the case report make very clear, in what they described to the peer-reviewed scientific editors. They said that's the reason this case is so important, is he had a near-death experience, and that enabled this extraordinary healing.
Mm.
So,
Do you have this inner knowing that this all happened to you because it was absolutely meant to, and this is what you are meant to be doing in life?
absolutely. And if you'd asked me 20 years ago, is that the direction you see your life going? I would have looked at you like you were crazy.
Yes.
Look back on all of it, it makes perfect sense. And the reason
Yes.
I also encourage people to embrace the hardships in life, because in
Mm.
so many ways, like my adoption abandonment wound, in many ways was a gift. It was how I had to deal with that in all these later years of my life and make sense of it, and then come to a very peaceful and loving resolution that fully encompasses the hardship and challenge and the hurdles that I faced early in my life. And that's true
Yeah.
for other things too. I mentioned, for example, that I stopped drinking in 1991. And that had to do with kind of the family history that I didn't discover until, decades later. But that family history also involved alcohol and troubles with alcoholism. So
Yeah.
I quit. It was never a problem at work. I quit it very early in my career. There was some drinking of scotch on my nights off, and I realized I was a little too comfortable with that, and
Mm.
that it was just not good for me, and it wasn't good for my being someone to take care of others. We
Yes.
our airline pilots drinking, and
Mm.
likewise, we don't want our surgeons drinking. I never
Mm.
drank at all with work, but the very fact that I would drink on my nights off call and I thought I was getting relief from my stress, that was a problem. So I stopped it. And that hardship of stopping was a beautiful gift. It was another part of my journey, especially as
Uh,
I find out the affliction that it had offered in my birth family.
Wow. Oh, I feel like we could just talk to you and ask you so many questions. It's been such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I'm
If
gonna
you want to,
I'm
I'd be happy to do that. And it might even make very good sense to have my best half, my partner Karen, involved in the conversation.
yes, definitely.
yes.
On all things about spiritual nature. She completely gets all this at a very deep level. She's been a spiritual mentor to me. And of course, she's the co founder of Sacred Acoustics, a form of
Yes.
binaural brainwave entrainment. And we explain a lot of that in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, why it is so powerful. But it's using slight differences in the frequency of the input signal to two ears to cause an oscillation in the lower brainstem. And that's where the real
Oh,
power comes from. I mean, we're all familiar with using like a pendulum to hypnotize somebody and put you in
yes.
a conscious state. EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, very successful treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
EMDR also involves rapid eye movements, that is a rapid oscillation in brainstem. But with sacred acoustics and binaural beat brainwave entrainment, we're actually going to a more primitive level, which makes it more powerful, because the whole thing, the whole reason that the oscillations in the lower brainstem are important is the more you get to the primitive levels of consciousness, the more you're able to liberate conscious awareness from the here, now, and sense of self, the illusion, the maya of our existence, that our consciousness is right here and just mine. Well, you find out that you're really sharing the mind of the universe. That's one of the biggest points we make in Living in a Mindful Universe.
Oh yes, we want you on for sure. We'll be locking
Definitely.
you in.
So much more to explore, which is fantastic.
Oh, we will definitely in the show notes obviously put links to all of your books, the things that you're doing. Yes, please. Can we have you both on? That just sounds like a whole different conversation that we can go with as well. And
Reach out through Elizabeth, and I'm sure she can arrange it all.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Eben. It's been such a pleasure. And yeah, we can't wait to have another conversation. And for anyone listening, please make sure you just click that subscribe button and make sure that you're not missing out on more conversations when we bring Dr. Eben back as well. So thanks again.
Listen, Diane, great talking with you. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for what you all do to get all this out there.
Thank you.
If you have enjoyed this episode or are a die-hard fan of the show, make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss out on future episodes. And to share the love, you can give us an awesome 5-star review.
Help us create a world that is spiritual as fuck.